Warning! Kinda Murdery contains adult themes, explicit language, and descriptions of violence. It is not suitable for anyone, and we recommend you stop listening now.
I'm Zevin Odelberg, and this is Kinda Murdery. The case I'm about to tell you about started out as a commonplace speakeasy stick-up in which a patrolman and a girl were wounded at 2:55 a.m. on the morning of January 31st, 1927, in New York City. The patrolman died on the evening of the same day and was buried with full departmental honors 3 days later. Long before the funeral, however, the case developed all the melodramatic features that make front-page crime serials or true crime podcasts. Occasionally, newspaper publicity helps an investigation. In this story, it would have been disastrous. And speaking of disasters, imagine being at a bar and inadvertently overhearing a conversation, as I'm sure all of us have any number of times in our lives, assuming that we occasionally go to bars. Except this stranger's conversation that you eavesdropped on by accident would lead you to a lifetime behind the barred windows of an insane asylum. Kinda Murderies. It was a face out of hell. The shooting of Patrolman Masterson starts now. At 2:35 a.m. on the morning in question, two well-dressed young men entered the bar room in the rear of a speakeasy on West 103rd Street. One of them, known to the bartender as Whitey, ordered highballs. 15 minutes later, two strange men sought admittance to the speakeasy and were vouched for by Whitey. They entered the dining room in the front and ordered coffee. There were about 16 patrons present, a well-behaved, prosperous after-theater crowd, each group of which was paying attention only to its own party. At 2:55, Whitey rose and sauntered nonchalantly toward the back of the bar. He whipped out a .38 caliber automatic and barked, "Stick 'em up!" Simultaneously, his companion took a stand at the other end of the bar and covered the occupants of the barroom, while the pair in the dining room whipped out revolvers and ordered the ham sandwich and coffee customers to stick 'em up and walk into the back room. There was a crash of broken glass and crockery where tables were tipped over by the terror-stricken men and women as they discreetly hastened to obey the command. Scores of times they'd read about such scenes in the newspapers and seen them in the movies. They knew that such things happened, of course to other people. That it should happen to themselves filled them with stunned amazement and horror. To one of the victims in the restaurant, however, the stick-up was not much of a surprise. Patrolman James H. Masterson, in civilian clothes, accompanied by 4 friends as camouflage, had visited the place on a tip that it was the hangout of 2 women who were being sought by the police. The capture meant certain promotion. For the moment, Masterson obeyed the order and with the others stumbled through the narrow passage that led to the barroom, obviously seeking the best vantage point from which to cover all 4 gunmen. But the instant Masterson lowered his hand, Whitey observed the action, wheeled toward him, and fired in his face. As the officer crumpled to the floor, a second shot took effect in the shoulder of a girl who'd been close behind him. Whitey's nefarious companion strode forward and kicked the prostrate policeman. "Get up there!" he snarled. The kick had disarranged Masterson's coat and revealed his badge and gun. "Oh, so you're one of the holster mob, are you?" the thug sneered. "Then take that, and that, and that!" And without the slightest provocation, he emptied his weapon into the wounded man's body as he lay on the floor unconscious. A few minutes later, Detectives Brady and Donnelly of the 12th Precinct arrived. They found Masterson lying on a table. His eyes were closed, his face was a ghastly sight, and his body was as motionless as death. "What's your name?" Brady asked him. "Hello, Brady," Masterson whispered, a crooked grin twisting his lips. "What's your name?" The detective spoke harshly in an effort to revive him. He succeeded. Years of discipline prevailed. "James Masterson." The words came faintly as from a distance. "And where do you live?" 218 West 190th Street. I'm a policeman attached to the 18th Division. "Do you believe you're about to die?" "I don't know. I don't." "Are you willing to make a true statement of how and in what manner you came to the injury from which you are suffering?" The formal inquisition went on. Dozens of times Masterson himself had put these same stereotyped questions to men picked up wounded to death. No one knew better than he how the police are handicapped by dying men's indifference or obstinacy in refusing to answer. With what the doctors later described as superhuman effort, he answered through gasping lips. "I was shot by a fellow, I don't know his name, but he hangs out around 50th and Broadway near Regal Shoe Store. He's about 26, white guy, 5'7", apparently American, wore sort of a blue overcoat, light gray shoes, hat. He was the man who took my shield and revolver while I lay on the floor. Hey, Brady, I guess I'm done for. Please, get me a priest." Then, complete collapse. How he managed to talk that much, the doctors in the Knickerbocker Hospital said later, was a miracle. Each word, it had seemed to Brady, would be his last. But Masterson carried on until he told all he knew. He died, without regaining consciousness, at 6:20 p.m. that evening. The autopsy performed by Medical Examiner Director Norris showed bullet wounds on the face, abdomen, and pelvis, internal hemorrhages, and shock. In cases of serious felonious assault where the victim is dying, the Homicide Bureau gets on the trail of the killer as soon as the hospital authorities state that their patient has no chance of recovery. Consequently, although Masterson wouldn't die until 6 p.m. that evening, it was at 9:15 the same morning of the shooting that Inspector Carey, who was the homicide chief, assigned his best detectives, Thomas Martin and Stephen G. Donahue, to the case. The first few hours were occupied in groping along the various channels of a routine investigation. They visited the scene of the crime and found the premises closed with a patrolman on guard. Bullet holes in the wall of the bar room, the kitchen door, overturned tables, broken glasses and dishes, a blood-stained floor and table were sinister souvenirs of the gunman's presence on the premises during the early hours of the morning. A careful search revealed no clues to the identity of the gangsters, so the detectives hurried over to the station house of the 12th Precinct, where half a dozen witnesses to the stick-up were being detained for questioning. So horrified were all of them at the vicious brutality of the gunman who had riddled the defenseless patrolman with bullets, that without exception, each outdid the other in furnishing the police with details. Their testimony was greatly beneficial. The witnesses had ample opportunity to get a good look at the four thugs, and the following descriptions were noted down. Bandit number 1, man known as Whitey, sharp features, clean-shaven, light gray coat, light gray soft hat. Number 2, unknown, dark overcoat, soft gray hat with black band, blue serge suit, about 25. Number 3, unknown, apparently an Italian. Number 4, no definite description. That the job was well planned and carried out with the coolness of experienced criminals was suggested by the statement made by one witness, a young, intelligent German man named Louis Ulrich. Ulrich said he'd been in the bar room when the shooting started. He knew the place well, and at first sign of trouble, he skinned out to the kitchen and climbed into the dumbwaiter, letting himself down into the cellar. The back door was locked, so he raced up the front stairway which led to the vestibule of the apartment house. In a mad rush toward the street door, he flopped right into the arms of a man with a gun. This man shoved him back into the speakeasy, where the stick-up men, on the point of leaving, delayed long enough to frisk him of all he possessed. Tenants in the building denied hearing any shooting, though one man claimed he did hear some explosions which he had assumed were caused by the backfiring of an automobile. Shortly after the police's arrival at the station house, a new eyewitness, a young woman, was brought in. She was extremely attractive, well-groomed and smartly dressed, but her face was very pale and haggard. "Here," one of the precinct men said, "is Miss Helen Grayson, who was shot the same time as Masterson. She said she wasn't badly hurt, only scared, so we let her go home to get over the shock before questioning her." Miss Grayson made a model statement. It was concise and clear and comprehensive. Certain of the witnesses had stated that it was a man known as Whitey who shot Masterson when he was lying on the floor. But on this point the girl was positive. She maintained that it was Whitey's companion. "I don't know that brute's name," she said, "but I would know him again if ever I see him. I'll never forget it as long as I live. It was a face out of hell." As she talked in the captain's private office, observers noticed that every now and then she gritted her teeth as if she were either laboring under a severe nervous strain or was suffering great pain. Suddenly, she collapsed, and Dr. Berry of the Knickerbocker Hospital was called in. He found that she had a serious gunshot wound in her shoulder and that it had already been attended by a physician, but the girl was taken to the hospital. Detectives resumed questioning witnesses. "Who," Detective Martin asked Bolton, the speakeasy bartender, "introduced the man as Whitey to you?" "Fellow by the name of Lanahan," the barkeep answered. "He owns a club up on Washington Heights on West 138th Street, and he's got an interest in our place." The witnesses were all escorted to police headquarters to review the pictures of holdup men in the Identification Bureau before appearing at the district attorney's office. Martin and Donahue subwayed uptown to the address given by Bolton, the bartender. It was around 1 o'clock in the afternoon. The Lanahan place was closed, but repeated hammering on the door brought out an old African-American caretaker who told the police that the place didn't open until 3 p.m. From the renting agent to the building, detectives obtained the club owner's home address, which was a first-class apartment house on Riverside Drive. The switchboard operator rang up the apartment, but received no answer. In the meantime, at police headquarters, Alarm 1297 covering the stolen property, the loot of the holdup, had been broadcast, and code signals on Alarm 1296 had been transmitted, reporting the theft of Masterson's .38 caliber Colt service revolver number 42923. One of the proprietors of the speakeasy, who'd been present when the stick-up was going on, stated that he would know at least 2 of the men if he were ever confronted with them, but that he'd never spoken to any of them. As he lay dying, Patrolman Masterson had mentioned that Broadway and 50th Street was the hangout corner of his assailant. On the off chance that one of the patrolmen covering that beat might know the man, detectives called at the 47th Street station home. Masterson had been a hot-headed young chap, but very much liked and respected by all who really knew him. In the detective's room at the 47th Street station house, his exploits were being discussed for the purpose of picking out which of the dozens of men who carried the alias of Whitey might have had it in for him. Among those present in the room was Patrolman Callahan, a buddy of Masterson's who looked on the case as a personal cause, as did all the police for that matter. Patrolman Callahan was a human who's who of Tenderloin characters. "There's Whitey Miller," he was saying as we joined the group. "He's got a record as long as your arm. Jim might have run into one of his gang. I haven't seen him hanging around the 50th Street corner, but I've often seen him in Lindy's, a Broadway restaurant near 50th Street, and sporting in on the nightclubs between 46th and 48th. In the last week or two, he had a dizzy blonde with him, one of those expensive dolls." "You mean a brunette," Detective Moore interrupted. "I saw him entering the Silver Skipper with a brunette who was dressed like $1,000,000. "I do not," Callahan said emphatically. "The female with Whitey was a blonde. Peroxide hair, blue eyes. The brunette was with his pal, one of those collegiate boys. Now what do we call him? Has something to do with tea? Ah, Oolah, that's it. Oolah, that's what they call him. And say, I seen him hanging around the corner of 50th and Broadway near the Regal shop. I don't know where Whitey picked Oolah up, but he's been pickled as a dill every time I seen him. Don't belong to Whitey's old gang." It was arranged that officers Callahan and Moore should make the rounds of the Broadway nightclubs in an effort to pick up this Whitey. There was no photograph of him in the station house, so Detective Martin telephoned the Identification Bureau at headquarters to rush off copies of the picture of the man Callahan referred to. Then, he and Donahue left to return to Linahan's club. "Looks bad. Linahan keeping out of sight this way, Steve," Martin said to his partner as they walked to the subway. "Must have known we'd trace the gunman to his doorstep." Donahue mumbled. "Of course, Linahan may be all right, but he sure is acting foolishly to keep out of the way. It's funny how reckless speakeasies are in handing out cards to people who are practically absolute strangers. I wonder if they got anything on the fingerprints." "Nope," Donahue replied. "I called him up. The table where Whitey and his companion were seated was knocked over and the glasses were smashed to smithereens. Nobody seems to know at what table the other two were seated." When the detective sought admission to Linahan's club, it was around 4 p.m. Only the manager, a taciturn individual named Doherty, and a couple of waiters were in place. The owner, they were told, was not expected to return until late in the evening, if then. "Okay," said Donahue. "We'll stick around. When he calls up again, you tell him we're here and waiting to see him." Doherty received this announcement with a dark scowl. He opened his lips as if to make a biting retort, thought better of it, and disappeared somewhere into the hinter parts of the club. Martin and Donahue immediately started to make thorough examination of the place. They didn't expect to find anything, but there was always the chance of falling across some trifle that might develop into an important clue or a battering ram to break down the silence of a bulky customer. Later on, when diners and dancers crowded around the little tables, the place might be lively enough. But at that hour in the afternoon, it was as cheerful as a cemetery on a rainy evening. "Hoo-wee!" Donahue gave vent to an almost whispered whistle. "Look here, Tommy," he said. Martin skidded across the waxed dance floor and glanced at the spot on the wall where he was pointing. It was about 3.5 feet from the floor, a small hole with a singed edge through which the white plaster showed, made by a bullet, and not long ago, Martin said in an undertone as after one look he turned and walked to the other side of the room away from possible eavesdroppers. Listen, Donahue, I'll go to the telephone and find out if any stick-up was reported from here recently. If not, that'll give us something to stick the needles into Linehan with. As Martin stepped out into the dusk of the late winter afternoon, he almost collided with Detectives Brady and Teed, who were also in the hunt for Linehan. Steve Donahue's inside, he told them. I'll be back in a few minutes. After the necessary delays, Martin learned that no shooting had been reported by Linehan's club and that a man named William McGlynn had applied at the Roosevelt Hospital at midnight of the 30th for the treatment of gunshot wounds in his right arm and shoulder. He had refused to tell who had injured him. Armed with this information, Detective Martin returned to the resort and found Donahue, Brady, and Teed in conversation with a tall, sallow-complexioned man who faced them in an attitude of truculence. "Mr. Linehan says he doesn't know Whitey," Donahue told Martin as he approached the group, a skeptical smile on his lips. "Bolton made a mistake," Linehan muttered, and shut his teeth with a snap that could be heard about 3 feet away. "Well, of course that's possible," Martin said smoothly. "I'd like to talk with Mr. Linehan alone." The other 3 detectives immediately withdrew. "Why didn't you report the shooting in your place last Sunday when Mr. William McGlynn was seriously wounded, Mr. Linehan?" Martin asked. The question took him momentarily off his guard. His sallow face became a chalky white, and desperate, trapped expressions flitted across his deep-set grayish eyes. "Well, hello, everybody." A sweet, husky voice broke the silence. Martin glanced in the direction of the front door and saw a dazzling blonde wrapped in a slinky fur coat making what could only be described as a sensual entrance. Suddenly, the smile seemed to freeze on her lips. "Grab her," Brady, who was standing with his partner near the door, snapped out. Evidently Donahue obliged, for there was an indignant squeak followed by voluble protests from the direction of an inner door. Linehan seemed to be on the verge of collapse, so Detective Martin took his arm and led him to a nearby chair. "Sit down and tell me about the shooting. We'll find out about it anyway, so why not come across?" "I suppose so," he admitted in a cold, emotionless tone. "Well, McGlynn got in an argument with another fellow. I was in the back at the time. Then I heard a shot. The bouncer was throwing him out when I ran out to see what the trouble was. I've sunk all the money I possess in this place. I've only a very small interest in the 103rd Street restaurant, and I didn't want people to get scared away by bad publicity." "And Whitey?" Detective Martin urged. "I'm not going to ask you just now if Whitey and Oolah were here on Sunday night when McGlynn was shot. Of course it's going to go bad with you if you withhold information." Detective Martin let this sink in for about a minute and noticed the nervous lacing and unlacing of Linehan's fingers and the perspiration that beaded his forehead. Martin listened to the murmured conversation of the girl and the 3 detectives. "If I could see Bolton," Linehan said at last, "perhaps he could refresh my memory." "That's good enough," Martin agreed. "Let's go and see Bolton together. Where does he live?" "He works in a saloon on the West 23rd Street during the daytime," Linehan said, rising shakily from his chair. "Before we go, I'd like to have a few words alone with Miss DaCosta." Detective Martin looked in the direction of the girl and her 3 unwelcome companions. Whatever the latter were saying to her was obviously being ill-received. Her rouged lips were drawn in a hard, angry line, and her mascaraed eyelashes made slits of her long, narrow eyes. "Nope, don't interrupt," Martin said, casually taking a hold of Linehan's arm. Detective Martin called Donahue and explained that he was going with Linehan in search of Bolton. "Have you ever been arrested?" Martin asked Linehan as they walked to the subway. "No," he answered promptly. "Never been questioned by the police before?" "Nope." "Then let me give you a bit of advice. Tell the truth. If you don't, you're going to find yourself in a nasty hole. And if you're trying to protect Whitey, you'll find yourself in the can before you know it." "I ain't trying to protect Whitey," he muttered. "I'm trying to protect myself." "Whitey threaten you?" Martin asked. Linehan didn't answer, and in silence they traveled until they reached the corner cafe on West 23rd Street near the ferries. It was an old-time saloon. The bar was being used as a quick lunch counter. Martin and Linehan passed the entrance and entered the vestibule of a tenement that had been built over the grog shop. They hoofed it up to the 2nd floor and there found Bolton presiding over a thickly crowded brand-new bar. It was one of those speakeasies that abounded along the waterfront and persisted in spite of steadily demolishing raiders. Bolton was a powerful, ruddy-faced chap with eyes as guileless as a baby's and a simulated genial expression. He was the opposite of Linehan, who was a sharp-featured, cynical-looking fellow with cruel thin lips and deep-set black eyes. "I think it would be better if I spoke to Bolton alone," Linehan said nervously, glancing around the room. "Well, that's all right with me," Detective Martin said, and sat down at a small, liquor-stained round table. Linehan took a place at the end of the bar, which was deserted by the boisterous patrons, who were crowding chummily at the end nearest the door. Glancing at his watch, Detective Martin saw that the hands pointed to 6:30. He ordered a glass of small beer and slipped into the telephone booth. So loud were the wisecracks and accompanying raucous laughter coming from the great husky longshoreman that Detective Martin had to cup the mouthpiece before Central could hear the number he gave. When he was connected with Inspector Coughlin, he told him that he was busily following up a lead that promised developments. "Masterson died at 6:20, the inspector said when Martin had finished. "Get in touch with Donahue." Now, just in case you, like I for a moment, thought, wait a minute, Masterson's already dead. If you'll remember, Masterson was shot at 2:55 a.m., and once hospital authorities determined that Masterson wouldn't recover from his wounds, the homicide investigation started at 9:15 a.m. that same morning of the shooting. So everything you've heard up to this point was prior to the medical death of Patrolman Masterson. And if you want to find out what happens next in the investigation into the murder of Patrolman Masterson, and what that conversation was that ripped the sanity away from at least one man's mind, then please rejoin me this Sunday, June 4th, for Part 2 of It Was a Face Out of Hell, the shooting of Patrolman Masterson. Until then, I'm Zevin Odelberg, and this has been Kinda Murdery.